Every Halloween, doors across the country are knocked on by things that aren't human. And these 13 terrifying stories prove that sometimes the real horror begins after you open it. Tonight, Scribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The road to Widow's Hollow was narrower than I remembered. A jagged scar cutting through skeletal trees that bent toward my headlights like silent witnesses. I hadn't been back in years, not since my grandmother passed, leaving behind a house more myth than home. Yet something about this Halloween night pulled me back. Maybe guilt, maybe nostalgia, or maybe the gnawing curiosity about the stories people told of the place. They called it cursed ground, where travelers vanished without trace, and doors answered knocks from no human hand. I told myself I didn't believe any of it, but belief doesn't stop the wind from howling. By the time I reached the farmhouse, the storm had swallowed the sky. Lightning cracked above the roofline, revealing the sagging porch and peeling shutters like a corpse refusing to stay buried. I stepped inside, greeted by the musty breath of decades-old dust and the faint scent of my grandmother's lavender sachets still clinging to the walls. The air felt wrong, heavy, as if the house had been holding its breath for my return. I told myself it was just memory playing tricks. But deep down, I knew memory was never the only thing alive here. I wandered through the halls with a flashlight, its beam slicing across faded wallpaper and framed photographs whose faces seemed to follow me. The house groaned with age, but beneath that familiar sound, something else stirred, a rhythm too deliberate to be the wind. Then, from somewhere deep within the structure, 3 slow measured knocks echoed. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. No one else knew I was here. I opened the front door, but the porch was empty, the rain carving silver lines into the dirt. Another knock, louder this time, came from the kitchen door. I hurried there. Nothing. Then the parlor window. Knock, 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 though no branches touched the glass. It was as if the house itself was playing a game, testing my reactions, growing bolder with each unanswered sound. And with each one, something primal stirred beneath my ribs, a dread I couldn't reason away. In the attic, I found her journals, brittle and ink-faded, stacked beneath a moth-eaten quilt. She had written about the knocks too. They learn, one entry read. They listen. They map the living the way ants map the skin. Another page mentioned a legend older than the town itself. Visitors who could not cross a threshold uninvited, so they mapped the walls with sound. Learning every weakness until a path opened, the knocks became more frequent, more precise. They came from corners they shouldn't, places no one could reach. And though no door opened, the house itself felt like it was shifting, aligning, drawing invisible lines around me. Like fingers tapping on a coffin lid, each knock felt like a countdown. Then came the one that stopped my breath. Knock. 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 From the wall right behind my head, and this time it wasn't just sound. The plaster pulsed. Something was feeling its way through. I backed away, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to leave. But the knocks followed me down the hall, closer, sharper, almost curious. Whatever was out there wasn't just trying to get in. It was learning where I was, and then from the door to my grandmother's old room, the one that had always stayed locked, came a final, deliberate knock. 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 It was waiting. The key to my grandmother's room was supposed to be lost, yet it lay in my pocket, cold as a coin on a tongue. I didn't remember packing it. The hall smelled of damp wood and lavender, and the storm rattled eaves like teeth. The knocks kept their tempo. 3 beats, a pause, 3 more, like a metronome training my fear to march. I ran for the truck and the road that stitched the hollow to the world, but the sound shifted. The knocks weren't just closer. They traced me, mapping the distance between breath and bone. My flashlight sputtered, and in that brief dark the wall rippled, a slow exhale through plaster. When the beam steadied, hairline cracks fanned in careful geometry, like an invisible surveyor had inked a blueprint through the house. Why did my chest feel included? I slid the key into her door. The lock sighed. Moonlit dust hovered above the bed, the shape of sleep still impressed in the sheets. On the vanity, journals waited beneath river stones. I opened one to a page marked with dried asters. "They cannot count what does not hold still," she had written. "Keep moving, speak back," confused the echo. It sounded absurd. Yet grief often wears the mask of faith, and tonight faith felt like the only tool I had left. So I moved. I paced in uneven steps, tapped irregular rhythms on the floor, whispered nonsense syllables into corners like a broken radio. I knocked back in messy patterns, 1, 4, 2, 5, refusing the neat trios that had colonized the halls. The answering tempo fractured, confidence bleeding from the wood. I pictured a cartographer forced to sketch a coastline during a storm, lines slipping, borders smearing, patience thinning. What happens when the surveyor loses the map entirely? The storm intensified. Rain drummed the roof like 1,000 fingernails. The walls still pulsed, yet weaker now, as though the house remembered how to breathe on its own. I read aloud, letting her sentences unwind like ribbon. Harvest dances, chalked hopscotch to break patterns, widow's bells tolling off tempo so counters lost track. The knocks retreated down the hall, then to the parlor, then beneath the floorboards, like a tide shoved back by contrary wind. I followed to the foyer, where the air felt denser, thick as cooling glass. I knocked once on the door, twice on the wall, once on the banister, a crooked constellation of noise. The reply came late and clumsy, as though whatever listened had been pushed far away. Lightning forked the field. For a heartbeat, the house straightened, like a spine adjusting after years of pain. Yet something still waited, patient and precise, wanting one last coordinate. Dawn bled into the clouds. I turned the deadbolt and stepped onto the porch, the storm suddenly tender, a wet hand on a fevered brow. Then a final knock sounded behind me, soft, deliberate, from inside the door I had just closed. I walked to the truck and did not look back. Every Halloween always, wherever I sleep, I hear 3 knocks and feel the key in my pocket, colder than truth. I once thought something wanted in. Now I understand. Some maps chart people, not places, and I have been the territory all along. But it felt like an experiment the moment masks crossed my parents' threshold. Speakers shook the windows. Streamers hung like shed skins, and heat fogged the glass until outside was only our reflection. Around 10, a 13th guest drifted in without a word. Slim and patient, it wore a pale mask, too quiet for the noise. Its stare was a cold scalpel, slicing laughter, stopping conversations. It didn't dance or flinch at spills. It stood in the doorway, and that gaze kept finding me. I offered a plate and a joke, a path to say you must be with someone. The mask turned, and something in my chest cooled, like a window sliding open in winter. No voice came, only breath filtering through whatever lay beneath. Up close, the surface wasn't smooth. It held pores, faint ridges, a crescent scar where a cheek should have been. Surely latex, I told myself. Surely a prop shop special. But certainty can be a costume too. My friends didn't notice. We had dares to finish and photos to stage. Someone whispered about the basement. The door no one opened. The lock my parents said had rusted shut decades ago. "We'll go at midnight," someone promised, because midnight makes cowards sound brave. But what we didn't expect was how the house would answer first. The power flickered after the countdown, the music stuttering like a heartbeat skipping. In that pocket of dark, the masked guest was elsewhere. Back hall, then kitchen, then framed by the basement door that had no right to be open. A draft breathed up the stairs, wet and mineral, like a cave exhaling. When light returned, damp crescents marked the floor. Muddy footprints, small at first, then larger, overlapped as though 2 paths had learned to share one. We followed them to the porch, where the prints blurred into rain. No one confessed. We made jokes we didn't feel and parted with hands that shook. By morning, the lock hung snapped on the basement hasp. My parents shrugged at corrosion and kids, and I pretended to agree, though the mineral air still sat on my tongue like a coin. Days later, Maya didn't text back. Her mother called, voice clipped with fear. Police came and left with theories so light they floated. I watched party videos frame by frame. In each clip, the masked guest stood closer to the lens than I remembered, always angled toward the camera. Under magnification, the mask resolved. Pores not molded but alive once. Hair not stitched but rooted. An edge along the jaw the color of healed leather. I took the footage to a biology teacher. He spoke about collagen, tanning, antique ways to preserve identifiers. The logic was clinical. The effect was nauseating. If the mask was a map, someone had charted a person and worn the country over their face. Was the visitor human or something wearing humanity? That night I dreamt of stairs, not going down but coming up, careful as if becoming human required practice. When I woke, the basement door was closed again. A cold iron lock fitted. Still as I stood in the hall, a draft curled around my ankles, and from below rose the memory of a wet step taken with patience. I lasted 3 nights before the house convinced me to listen. The basement steps spoke a slow vocabulary. Grain creaks, nail clicks, a hush like damp cloth wrung out. I told myself I was going down for evidence, but really I was going for gravity. It felt as if a string were tied to my sternum and tugged. At the landing, my phone light carved a tunnel through dust, and the air cooled the way breath cools on porcelain. Halfway down, photographs glimmered along the studs. They weren't of us at the party. They were of our backs, our profiles, our hands lifting cups, our mouths mid-laugh. In the last photo, the masked guest blurred the foreground while the basement door upstairs yawned open. Behind that threshold, a smear of blackness held the posture of a person. Did we invite it by looking away or by looking too long? Footprints patterned the dirt in mirrored pairs, small beside large, heel to heel like rehearsed steps. A workbench waited under burlap. I lifted the cloth. Jars lined the plank. Salt, oil, strips of something pale coiled like quiet eels. An open notebook showed faces measured with calipers, arcs penciled like constellations. In the margin, a question in Maya's handwriting. If you map someone perfectly, what part do you take? Awe arrived first, then anger, then grief metallic on the tongue. A sound rose behind me, gentle as a spoon tapping a glass. 3 soft clicks, then 3 again. The metronome I'd blamed on the stranger belonged to my own ribs. My fear had trained the rhythm, and the rhythm had trained the room. I broke it with nonsense. 4 knocks, then 1, and called Maya's name into the cool. My voice came back altered, like it had learned a new mouth. What I didn't expect was an answer that wasn't sound. The mask leaned from shadow, held at arm's length by a figure child tall and fog-shaped. Up close, the surface was unmistakable, human hide, cured to obedience. Pores like unblinking seeds. Where eyes should have been, the openings were rimmed with rusted thread. You keep what you can map, I breathed, because science can be a prayer in another accent. The figure lifted the mask as if asking me to prove I knew the rule. I ran. I blundered through night corridors past a mirror that once taught me my own face. Police arrived to my breathless report and found only mildew, tools, and a mouse-chewed scrapbook. Their paperwork sliced the night into neat paragraphs while my memory spilled like oil, thick and iridescent. I scrubbed the floors. I boxed the decorations. I tried to live forward as if a future could be rented by the month. A year later on Halloween, a parcel waited on my step. Brown paper, no stamp, twine thin as veins. Inside lay a mask the color of tea and old scars. I lifted it, and it warmed like something that remembered sunlight. When I pressed it to my face, it settled without air between us, gentle as a returning hand. It fit me perfectly. The strap cinched, and in the mirror my mouth practiced a smile not mine. Somewhere below the floor, small feet resumed the rhythm. And upstairs my phone created a new album. Guests. The road to Willow Creek narrowed until it felt like a seam ripped through the hills. One careless tug from splitting the countryside open. My GPS spun without conviction. Rain stitched at the windshield, and the map on my lap smelled like wet newspapers and old promises. I was there as a census worker. Numbers, names, years. But Halloween had turned the valley into a negative image. Bright where it should be dark, and strangely quiet where there should have been dogs, radios, the thrum of a television behind curtains. It was work, I told myself, just fields made of facts. Houses leaned into the creek like tired listeners. Porches caved. Glass clouded by seasons of breath that had long since moved on. Every mailbox held the same brittle advertisement, each one postmarked a decade earlier. All of them were empty except the house at the bend. White paint puckered like scabbed milk and a cornfield standing at attention behind it, stalks whispering like paper ribs. Children watched from its windows, pale as frost lines on an old jar. faces unblinking, hands poised as if they'd been told to wait and never taught what for. Their eyes were lanterns in a graveyard, guiding me toward something I shouldn't see. I lifted my clipboard, the gesture of a professional life preserver, and rehearsed the calm questions that turn strangers into rows. They didn't wave. They didn't tilt their heads. They simply made space with their stillness. Training says approach with neutrality, but the air had that cellar-cool density that remembers footsteps. I logged property IDs, cross-referenced parcels, and felt the first hairline crack in the logic. County records showed mortgages closed. Occupants deceased, tax liens satisfied by heirs unknown, all dated more than a century ago. But what I didn't expect was the way the children matched the ledgers, surnames I'd read in microfilm, first names that had once been carved into school registers with careful ink. A breeze rolled through the field, smelling of iron and rain-bruised corn, and the house answered by tightening. Timbers clicked the way teeth do when a cold thought passes through. I stepped onto the porch, boards flexing like old lungs. The door wore 3 locks, 2 bright and recent, 1 ancient and stubborn as a knot. My job requires doors. Doors require trust. Trust requires time. I noted weathering, snapped photos, measured distances, habits that keep fear inside the parentheses. Yet the numbers felt like shells, pretty and light. Something heavier pressed beneath them, coded like a forgotten map. The children moved together, a small choreography of glances, each gaze settling at the doorframe, then back to me, as if checking whether I understood basic math. They were not trapped. They were positioned. The thought arrived quiet and clean, like a scalpel laid on a tray. I remembered the briefing slides about abandoned communities, the caution against forcing entry, the reminder that data collection ends where safety begins. But what if safety was the thing being collected? I circled the house to record outbuildings, an old smokehouse, a well hooded like a monk, and each structure wore the same signature. Boards reinforced from the inside, latched outward as if the hinges had been persuaded to hold their breath. The creek hissed against the bank. A crow stitched a single thread of sound across the corn. I put my ear to the siding and heard something that was not wind. A cycling hush, a slow exhale, as rhythmic as tide in a sleeping mouth. A key lay on the mat, flat brass, wet with the kind of dew that grows on things left too long. The children watched me without blinking, with the patience of a ritual. The top lock clicked of its own accord, a polite surrender. My hand hovered at the knob and the wood under my palm felt warm, like a living wrist. What if the doors weren't meant to be opened? The second lock turned with a sigh that smelled faintly of apples left to soften in a cellar. From behind the third lock, something tapped once, then again, as if answering attendance. The third lock didn't turn so much as relent. A stiff click followed by a small release of breath I could taste on my tongue. Cellar sour, threaded with apple and rust. The children did not flinch. They stepped back from the windows in unison, allowing a narrow path of sight through the glass, like ushers at the edge of a procession. I told myself I was here to count residents, but counting requires boundaries, and the house felt boundaryless, like a lung stitched to the weather. I opened the door 2 inches and not more. Warmth exhaled across my knuckles. The foyer stretched long and narrow, floors scrubbed to a soft sheen, a runner braided from corn husks leading toward an interior door whose frame was latticed with iron staples. An odor rode the air I could not place at first. Ozone after lightning, damp linen, a faint waxy sweetness, as if rain and candle smoke had married underground. I called into the dark, careful, the way you speak to animals you do not want to startle. Nothing answered but the house settling, a patient vertebrae clicking. My training said step through. My spine said do not. Still, work has its rituals. I announced my name, the agency, the date, as if a form could bless a threshold. The hallway opened like a throat. On either wall, photographs had been nailed in grids. Not portraits, but doorways from every building I had passed, each image captioned by a child's careful hand. Under one, a penciled note, stay. Under another, hold. Their eyes at the window were lanterns in a graveyard, I thought, but not to guide me in, to guard me out. I reached the interior door. Passing my palm across the iron lattice, I felt cold radiate outward, not temperature as much as intent. The staples pinned a seam like sutures. Behind the wood, The hush became a hum, became a whispering clock. If the children were keepers, then the house was a cage, and the cage contained a tide that learned the rhythm of knuckles. The handle turned beneath my fingers without a sound. The key from the mat weighed my pocket, suddenly heavier than brass. "Don't," I whispered to myself, an admission as small as breath. I shut the front door, replaced 2 locks, and backed away across boards that flexed like elder trees. When I reached the porch, the children nodded once, solemn as clergy, then raised their hands and pressed their palms flat to the glass. For a moment, the panes clouded in the shapes of leaves. The children never breathed. I ran then, across gravel slick as scales, through a rain that seemed to push me from the valley. At the ridge, I looked back. The cornfield bent a single bough, and the house settled deeper, as if relieved to anchor its storm. The creek hissed like a kettle refusing sleep. I filed my report in neutral language. I slept with my ear to silence. I never returned. Weeks later, an envelope arrived without a stamp. Inside was a single sheet. "We're still waiting." Below the line sat a child's signature that matched my handwriting in every loop and hesitation, as if the letter had been addressed from a room behind my ribs. I rented Harrowby Place the way some people adopt stray storms, knowing it would make a mess of me and pretending that was research. The lease fit a graduate stipend by miracle. 3 floors of Victorian bric-a-brac, a winter garden of iron, and an attic stitched into the roof like an afterthought. My thesis followed phantom plans, buildings sketched into rumor, never built. The caretaker slid me 1 key and 1 warning. "There is a door upstairs that should not be opened." I laughed. For weeks I treated the attic like a museum of dust. Sunlight bled through dormers and cathedral stripes, gilding trunks and castles of dust. At the gable end, half swallowed by rafters, rose a wooden arch sealed smooth as bone, no hinges, no handle, the grain running like frozen water. When I touched it, I felt the cool patience of wood. Still, I logged dimensions, snapped photos, and told myself curiosity was a professional hazard, like splinters or loneliness. Nights were kind. The house breathed like an old dog. Radiators ticked their rosaries, the conservatory clicked. Yet the arch entered my sleep as a silhouette with circulation, a shape that listened more than it appeared. I began trawling parish surveys, fire maps, club minutes, and forgotten journals, hunting the architectural hint of a resemblance. Each search returned a rumor of an arch where no records claimed a door. Coincidence is the laziest word I know. On Halloween, a lean wind combed the chimneys and braided the light into strands. I unboxed 19th century sketchbooks bought at an estate sale. Page after page showed facades that never reached foundation. A chapel with 13 bays, a boarding house bent around a keyhole court, a hospital whose stare repeated. In the margins, a motif recurred. The same sealed arch, penciled so softly it looked like breath on glass. Beside it, a note returned like a refrain, open only when asked. Dusk lowered like a theater scrim, and I climbed to the attic with resolve. The house changed timbre. Floorboards hummed faintly like a shell with C not there. I knelt before the arch and set my palm to it, half expecting splinters, half expecting nothing. The wood thrummed back, subtle as a pulse in a wrist you are not sure belongs to you. It was not a door. It was a pulse, and I was its vessel. I should have left, called the caretaker, called anyone. Instead, I listened. The clock downstairs coughed midnight into the stairwell. Then someone knocked from the other side, 3 spaced taps, and in the silence between them, my heart aligned to their metronome. I froze. The second set came slower, as if taking my measure, like a physician counting respirations. But what they did not expect was that I would answer. Research is another kind of haunting. Under lamplight, I matched proportions. The arch at Harrowby and ones in unbuilt churches, unfunded theaters, erased wards. The geometry held like a tune passed mouth to mouth. If a design appears where it should not, is it a mistake or a migration? The third set of knocks slid lower, finding the place where my ear met wood. Warmth gathered there, a breath through timber, and a pressure like a mouth about to speak. The attic air drew tight as thread. If I open it, will something come through or will I? The attic waited like a held note while the house exhaled through pipes. I pressed my forehead to the arch and felt the thud behind it steady into mine until I could not tell which led. Synchrony changes thresholds. Fireflies and hearts slip into chorus when the signal is strong. The knock slowed to match my breath, a language forming between wood and blood. I fetched my notebook and sketched the arch by feel. The curve refined into anatomy, not architecture. A valve, a lid, an eyelid sleeping. In the sketchbook, a scrawl I missed darkened as the paper warmed. Open only when asked, and only by the asked. The letters rose. 3 taps followed, intimate as a mouth at drumskin. I answered without thinking, 3 knuckles to wood. The reply lifted through me like a tide, filling nail beds, nudging bones. The lamp burned, as if the room had found oxygen. I felt giddy and ashamed, as though I had accepted a promise I couldn't quote. What I didn't expect was the clarity that arrived. Not colder air, but cleaner, like the attic had been washed and left to dry in a single breath. The arch smelled of rain before rain. I unrolled tools, chisel, mallet, a borrowed stethoscope, because credibility is a costume, and I needed a mask for the part of me that trembled. Through the bell I heard not emptiness but a chambered murmur, wind through a reed, miles condensed to inches. I whispered my name, the house, the year burned in the stair stringer, and the murmur repeated them back with a correction, aligning to an older cadence. The next knock arrived inside my ribs. I set the chisel to a seam that should not exist and tapped once. The grain parted like 2 lips considering a word. A smell rose, wax, copper, cellar apples, and my shadow stretched taller as light shifted. The house sighed through its joints. The 3rd knock came under my sternum, tender as a learned heartbeat. If I opened, would anything cross at all, or would the crossing be me? I pressed. The arch flexed, and my palm slipped through a warmth that was neither room nor weather. It felt like standing beneath a bell while a distant town decided noon. Pressure lifted me forward, each tendon humming. The attic tilted, ribs bowed. For a breath, I stood in 2 halls at once, one dusty with my footprints, one clean with mine erased. The lamp blinked. The notebook fell. My name reduced to rhythm, a pattern simple enough to knock. People ask later what I remember. Memory is plank and tar. It floats until the ocean decides. I remember bright cold and an echo wearing my shape. I remember a door like an eyelid opening from the wrong side of sleep. I remember answering and being answered, and how neatly the pulses nested, shells within shells. The rest is water across stone. I never finished the thesis, yet each Halloween someone knocks from the inside of whatever room I occupy, and the rhythm fits my heart the way a glove fits bone. I do not remember opening the door, but when strangers pause at their walls and listen, I am the one who answers. Knuckles patient, asking to be that arrives clipped and breathless, as if fear were conserving oxygen. Unknown problem, possible medical, the dispatcher said. Then an address map rendered as a capillary vanishing into pasture. I drove while my partner checked the radio like it could auscultate a house. Frost ribboned the ditches. Ahead, a candle burned in an upstairs window, a pin of amber in the dark. The family met us on the porch barefoot and stunned, voices fraying like wet thread. Inside, the air smelled of wax, wool, and metallic aftertaste of panic. They said the knocking started at midnight. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 again. Every time they opened the door, the porch was empty and the candle guttered, as if something had breathed through glass. Each knock was a heartbeat from the other side of the veil. We moved with the choreography night work gives you. Carbon monoxide monitor, EKG, pupils, lungs. The bodies were fine. The house was not. Along the jambs, square abrasions shone at shoulder height, the kind you see in hospitals where gurneys skim the same corner for years. This was a farmhouse. The geometry suggested repetition, a thing teaching itself a path the way water learns stone. Maybe a prank, my partner murmured, but pranks don't polish wood from the inside. I kept watching the candle. Folklore says a light guides lost spirits home. Photo taxes writ small, moths to flame, cells to current. But brightness can also lure hunters that track certainty. At 2:57, the house held still like a chest at the top of a breath. Filaments quivered. Even the dog stared at the door with the blank devotion of prayer. I radioed for backup and heard my voice thin. At exactly 3, every clock, digital wind-up phone, clicked into chorus. The first knock landed like a mallet on bone. The second sounded nearer, as if the door had stepped toward us. The third came from the candle window, a tap that made the flame bow. We opened the entry and found only wind-clawing hedges. Yet sound remained, not outdoors but within the wood, a tremor traveling the grain like a distant train. I shut the door. The tremor stayed. I set my stethoscope to the panel and a cadence unfolded. Lub-dub, pause, knock. Lub-dub, pause, knock. As if the house had borrowed a rhythm and couldn't stop keeping it. My partner touched the hinge and jerked back. The metal felt refrigerated. The family stood in a row, not speaking, like parishioners bracing for a name. Upstairs, the candle threw a spine of light down the hall. Wax tiered over the saucer, pooling like chipped enamel. The flame shortened, strengthened, then leaned toward the stairwell as though scenting oxygen. I climbed, each tread reporting my weight. At the top, the window seemed to breathe inward, a shallow denting, and the wick snapped without draft. For a heartbeat, the hallway smelled of creek banks after flood. The next knocks didn't wait. They coursed the lath like a hand searching arteries, then found mine. My chest answered. The candle tilted toward the last door on the hall, the one standing ajar by a breath. And below us, front latch slid back by itself, as if the house had decided the night could finally come in. The latch finished its crawl, and the door swung a finger's width until the night shouldered in like a cold physician. Wind braided through coats, and the candle's stub upstairs leaned harder toward hall, as if briefing me for triage. My partner called my name, but the sound felt filtered through wool. I stepped toward the stair to answer the front, and the knocks changed location without moving, a ventriloquism of wood. Each strike arrived beneath my sternum first, then echoed from the jamb, then the floor, each knock a heartbeat from the other side of the veil. The family clutched each other, faces glazed like porcelain left too long in winter light. What happens when the pulse you're measuring belongs to the room, not the patient? The door gave up a final inch. The porch was empty, but footprints bloomed on the boards like bruises in time lapse. Wet, then matte, then gone. My training said scene safety. My body said run. I chose protocol because courage wears uniforms. I reached for the handle as the upstairs flame straightened. A spinal correction, and the air tasted faintly of pennies and ash. But what I didn't expect was the sound from the chimney. An animal note, breath pushed backward through brick. We herded the family to the kitchen, away from the stairwell's throat. The dog refused to cross the threshold, claws sketching frantic commas on linoleum. I grabbed the fire extinguisher and scanned outlets, stove, the icy curve of the fridge. No source, no spark. The knocking accelerated anyway, a drummer losing politeness. It chased the baseboards, circled the room, then synchronized with the wall clock in a click-click of shared certainty. A candle downstairs would have been practical. This one upstairs felt like a lure. At 3:05, the flame elongated and separated, a filament pulling thin as taffy, then snapping. Darkness did not arrive. Something else did. Cold pressed us flat, and the door drifted open the last half-span as if drawn by tide. The family cried out together, not a word but a chord. I stepped into the foyer and saw the footprints return, reversed, heel first, toe last, as if whoever had come in now backed itself toward the night. Then the wick relit without spark. A hairline of fire traced the runner, found the stair, and licked upward like a fox discovering a henhouse. Wallpaper blistered. My partner shouted for the hose, for the blankets, for anything wet. I banged the extinguisher lever and carved a white cloud into the heat, but the flame ignored chemistry the way a storm ignores advice. It moved with intention, as if reading a map stenciled under paint. We got the family outside. Frost seized the grass. The house glowed from within like a lantern discovering its own wick. Glass sighed and failed. Rafters shuddered like ribs. Sirens moaned across the pasture, late as apologies, and the roof bowed, then folded, a shoulder finally setting. By dawn, the house was a charcoal sketch of itself. Investigators sifted for remains and found only a single candle, wick bright as noon, burning in a bowl of ash where the stair began. No bodies, no footprints, just that steady flame, as calm as a pulse that never belonged to ours. Ash Street looked cheapest in rain, which suited my budget and my mood. Vintage, the realtor said, a word that blesses peeled paint and a radiator that prays out loud. I signed because the rent didn't bite and the windows faced a maple. Later, a neighbor mentioned the rumor, The building sat over an asylum that misplaced its maps and then its patience. I laughed the way you do when a story wants lodging inside you. The first weeks were ordinary enough to be suspicious. My ceiling clicked like a metronome with a bad childhood. The hallway smelled of cumin and bleach, and the laundry room ate quarters as if saving for escape. I worked late, came home to the soft throb of other people's televisions, and learned the pipe's moods. Still, there was a seam in the silence you could run a finger along. It was like the building remembered, and I was part of its memory. On October 31st, rain stitched the streetlights into halos, and the lobby pumpkin sagged into a grin that had lost confidence. I microwaved dinner and scrolled local history, finding a photo of nurses lined like punctuation before a brick facade where my parking lot sits. The caption named Ashe County Sanatorium closed after a fire, archives incomplete. But what they didn't expect was how the night would finish the sentence the archive refused to write. Just before midnight, a knock arrived from inside my wall. Not on inside. 3 measured taps, then a pause that felt like a held breath. I set my palm to the paint. Warmth threaded my skin as if a sun lived in the plaster. Another knock traveled left, then up, learning studs like someone reading Braille from the wrong side. Each tap pulled my heart toward the surface until the beats and the knocks agreed on a tempo. I told myself it was pipes and made tea no one wanted. When the cupboard rattled back, I answered with a ridiculous knuckle tap, because humor is a small hammer for big doors. The reply came from the baseboard, sharper, eager. I mapped it with a pencil, an amateur seismograph, and watched little waves cross the line. It wasn't haunting but rehearsal, as if the room practiced how to be a room again. Curiosity is a fuse. I lit it. I cut a neat square in the plaster between studs, chalk dust perfuming the air like school. The blade kissed lath. Behind it, a space inhaled. When the panel dropped, cold spilled with old paper sweetness and a metallic hint, as if a coin had dissolved into weather. My light found a narrow cavity, then an opening beyond, a room walled off and ribbed by shadow. On the nearest plank, nails had been dragged to write 2 words, "Let us." I widened the hole and crawled, shoulder-scraping paint crumbs, breath bouncing back into my mouth. The hidden room held a cot, a rusted tray, and a window bricked from the other side. Scratch marks laddered the walls head high, some old as parched leaves, some startlingly fresh. Across the far board, a final word completed the demand, "Out." The knocking resumed behind me, counting now, and when I turned, the square I'd cut had slid half closed, peppering my tongue with grit. I wedged my fingers into the seam and held it open with a knee, telling myself doors only matter if they close. The knocking shifted again, not louder, just nearer, like a memory leaning in to whisper its corrected version. From the cavity, a draft moved past me, faint as moth breath, carrying iodine, soap, and paper learned by rain. I swept the light across the hidden room and found a second opening at floor level, no larger than a vent, edges bruised by tools and fingernails. Beyond lay a corridor I could not stand in, a throat made of lath and echo. Something thudded once, wood on wood or bone on wood. It was like the building itself was remembering, and I was part of its memory. I should have backed out, called the landlord, called anyone with daylight. Instead, I pushed the square wider and slid into the corridor on my side, shoulder and hip shuffling like a swimmer under ice. A handprint appeared ahead where my beam passed, 5 chalky stars blooming on the boards, then fading. But what I didn't expect was the answering print beside it, smaller, overlapping mine exactly, as if a forgotten gesture had learned my shape. The corridor bent left and narrowed. On one panel, tally marks stood like thin white trees, interrupted every 10th stroke by a deeper gouge, the cadence of seasons. Air moved with the patience of old churches. I muttered dates and listened to them return thinner, as if the wood were chewing numbers down to syllables. A tap kissed my heel. Another answered near my throat, and I realized the knocks were not chasing me. They were bracketing me. I reached a hatch and pushed. It swung into a second sealed room, twin to the first. Cot, tray, bricked window. The word "out" carved until the letters lost their temper. Beneath the cot sat a tin that once held biscuits. Inside, layered like shed skins, were notes in pencil, names, prayers, recipes, a map of rooms that did not match the apartment layouts above. In the corner, a circle had been drawn and labeled "Listen." The circle fit my palm. I listened. At first, only the pulse in my ears, then a deeper cadence, like a train held forever in a tunnel. Plaster ticked, nails settled. The corridor behind me breathed in and out, and the breath arranged itself into 3 measured taps, the sober rhythm of someone asking permission. Each knock was a metronome for panic. Each pause asked me to decide who us included. Can something forgotten still claim you? I backed toward my hole. The square had slipped farther. When I reached for the edge, the panel complained, then gave, and I spilled into my lit apartment, a diver cracking through to air. The knocks followed to the hallway, then the stairwell, then the street, lighter each step, like footsteps receding down an old corridor I now wore under my clothes. I moved away, but every Halloween a patient tapping finds whichever wall I choose, and I press my palm to paint like a stethoscope to a chest, listening as the building remembers me, and I remember I let us include me. We were 9 and fearless, children who thought the future was a hallway that never ends. Halloween fell on a Friday, leaves skittering like copper coins across the sidewalk, and my brother Eli proposed the dare that turned our house into a ledger. Answer every knock tonight, he said, even if nobody's there. We shook on it over a bowl of candy corn. The rule felt simple. The night, infinite. The first knock came before dusk, toddlers in planet costumes wobbling on our steps. The second was teenagers smelling of spray paint and warm cola. By the 6th, the street had thinned to moths and porch bulbs. Eli kept the tally on his forearm with a felt-tip star for each answer. The knock wasn't a greeting, it was a collection notice, and we kept paying in opens and laughter. At 9:30, the wind arrived, a traveling salesman of cold, and the neighborhood dimmed. Our parents were late from the hospital, leaving us with the kind of permission that is really an absence. We sat on the mat, guarding the door as if it were a campfire. But what we didn't expect was how quiet the street could get when it finally decided to listen back. At 10, the 8th knock landed low, cheeky, like a friend crouched to joke. I pulled wide and found only a smear of breath on the air, the kind winter writes on glass. Eli grinned and added another star. At 11, the 12th arrived, 3 polite taps, and the porch light flickered as if a hand had shadowed it from within the bulb. We waited for the 13th like sailors watch a horizon. Midnight set its jaw. The house clicked as though reconsidering its joints. When the knock came, it was soft but exact, the way a pen touches a signature line. I opened to a figure in a long black coat, the beak of a plague doctor mask, glossy as wet ink. He held a sheet of paper between gloved fingers. The porch light made the page look jaundiced. Eli whispered that it was theatrical. My mouth forgot how to be brave. The paper said, "One of you owes a debt." No amount, no terms, just that sentence, printed in a font that changed every time I blinked. Blocky, cursive, a crude hand like a child's. The masked man did not breathe in the way people breathe. Air moved around him as if repelled. His hat brim collected falling leaves that never settled. Eli reached for the page and the man did not resist. He tilted his head once, bird-like, then pointed with 2 fingers to the center of our door, tapping twice as though identifying a vein. He stepped off the porch without descending, a refusal of gravity, and vanished down the darkness between lawns. Eli laughed, nerves ricocheting, and folded the paper into his pocket like homework he could fix later. We answered no more knocks. The stars on Eli's arm began to sting. Around 2, I fell asleep against the door with candy dust in my teeth. At dawn, our parents found it open by a hand's width. I found our hallway cold as an apology and Eli's shoes sitting neatly beside the mat, their laces tied in unfamiliar knots. Morning arrived like a lie. Sunlight spilling across the kitchen tiles, toast scent in the air, and Eli gone. At first I assumed he was hiding, crouched behind furniture, waiting to yell boo and make me spill my cereal. But every corner was empty, his shoes still by the door, his jacket on the peg. The paper with the words, "One of you owes a debt," lay unfolded on the mat, its edges curling slightly inward, as if drawn toward something unseen. My parents thought he'd run to a friend's house. The police wrote possible runaway and filed a report, but I knew better. Eli wouldn't leave without his shoes. The years that followed were made of absence. My parents sold the house. I changed cities, changed names, tried to build a life that didn't echo with unanswered knocks. And yet every Halloween they returned, always at midnight, always 13 in total. It didn't matter where I was, a sixth-floor apartment in Chicago, a cottage by a lake in Vermont, even a sterile hotel room 2 states away. Knock, knock, knock. I never opened the door again, but not opening doesn't mean they stopped coming. One October, nearly 25 years after Eli vanished, a package appeared on my doorstep. No return address, no postage, just my name written in handwriting that mimicked my brother's from when he was 9. Inside was the same note. One of you owes a debt. Only now, below it, my own name was written in a different, older hand. The letters curved in ways no modern typeface does, as though they had been written with a quill. I stared at it for hours, feeling a pressure in the room, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer to watch. What happens when the debt you've ignored your whole life finally matures? That Halloween, the knocks came earlier, not at midnight, but at 11:47. They were louder now, heavier, resonant, as though the wood itself were vibrating with anticipation. Knock, knock, knock. I stood in front of the door barefoot, heart syncing with the rhythm, the same way it had the night Eli disappeared. The paper lay on the floor beside me, and this time, it wasn't blank beneath the demand. A line had appeared where no ink had been before. The collector does not forget. Something in me broke. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe just exhaustion from decades of running. I placed my hand on the knob. The metal was cold, colder than anything natural. It hummed faintly like a heart pressed against glass. When I turned it, the latch clicked softly, like the clearing of a throat before a long-awaited conversation. The door swung open, and the night outside seemed wrong. The street was empty, the air still, the stars frozen mid-twinkle. At the edge of the porch stood a boy, small, barefoot, wearing the same Spider-Man costume he'd worn the night he vanished. He smiled like no time had passed at all. "You're late," he whispered, and the paper in my hand dissolved into ash. I stepped forward without meaning to, and the world tilted, the streetlights dimming, the doorway stretching like the mouth of a tunnel. The last thing I remember is Eli reaching for my hand, his fingers cold as river stones. Now each Halloween, a knock echoes on someone else's door. Sycamore Lane was the kind of street where nothing ever happened, until it did. A row of maple-shaded houses, porches sagging under decades of Halloween pumpkins, and neighbors who waved more out of habit than warmth. I'd lived there long, enough to memorize the rhythm of the place. The mail truck's groaning brakes, the barking of the Henderson's dog, the soft knock-knock of Mr. Reeves next door, who always came by with leftover coffee cake on Sundays. That rhythm shattered the night he vanished. It was Halloween, of course it was, and the air carried that metallic chill that always feels older than autumn itself. Kids had long gone home, their costumes discarded like shed skins on lawns. I was cleaning candy wrappers off my porch when I heard it. A sharp knock from Reeves's door, 3 houses down. It was past midnight, too late for visitors, too deliberate to be a mistake. I saw his porch light flicker on through the trees. He opened the door, and then, nothing. No shout, no slam, no footsteps, just silence. By morning, Reeves was gone. Police came, shrugged, and left with theories made of air. Maybe he'd gone to visit family, maybe he'd wandered off. But Reeves had no family, and he'd never missed a single Sunday visit in 8 years. Days bled into weeks, and his house stood still, mail piling like sediment on the steps. I tried not to think about it, but the absence hummed beneath everything, like a note only I could hear. 3 weeks later, it came back. It was a knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. At my door this time. It was late again, later than anyone decent would knock. I froze halfway to the door, my fingers cold around the handle. The porch light hummed to life on its own. Through the frosted glass, I saw a silhouette. Familiar height, familiar stance, head cocked slightly to the left, the way Reeves always did. My heart thudded once, then again, syncing with the rhythm of the knocks. When I opened the door, he was standing there. Reeves, or something that looked exactly like him. Same corduroy jacket, same crooked glasses, even the faint scar on his chin from when he fell trimming hedges. But something was wrong. His smile was stretched too far, his lips trembling at the corners, as if he'd forgotten how to use them. And his eyes, they were vacant, glossy, like polished stones pretending to see. It wore his skin like a poorly tailored suit, close enough to fool, wrong enough to chill. "Evening," he said, and my breath snagged. His voice was perfect, exactly his. He asked about my job, mentioned my sister's recent visit, details he should know. But there was a gap beneath the words, an emptiness I couldn't name. I asked where he'd been. He tilted his head again, too sharp this time, like a puppet adjusting its strings. Then he said something Reeves could never have known, a memory I'd told no one. And that's when I realized it wasn't trying to pretend to be him. It was becoming him. That night I didn't sleep. The words circled me like vultures, and the knock echoed through my bones. What if the thing knocking already knows how you'll answer? What if it's counting on it? I told myself I wouldn't open the door again. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't come to visit. It had come to practice. The next night, the knocks came again. Same rhythm, same time. 3 soft raps that carried deeper than they should, like they were striking something inside me rather than the wood. I sat in the dark, every light off, breath held shallow. Through the curtains I saw the shape again, swaying slightly as if impatient. It didn't knock again. It didn't need to. It already knew I was listening. By the 3rd night, the pattern shifted. The knocks moved. First on the front door, then the side window, then the back porch, as though it was mapping my house the way an animal traces the edges of its cage. And always when I peered through the glass, I saw the same figure, Reeves, or what was left of him. Its movements grew smoother each time, the awkwardness fading, the smile inching closer to something human. It was learning, studying, perfecting. I started digging into stories, not police reports because there were none, but older things. Folklore buried in library basements, myths whispered by desert tribes and northern hunters, tales of beings older than language, things that shed and wear and shed again. They were called many names, mimics, flesh thieves, skinwalkers. Not ghosts, not demons, predators. They didn't just steal forms, they replaced them. Slowly, patiently, until even the memories of the original faded. But what I didn't expect was how much it already knew about me. It spoke through the door sometimes now, mimicking Reeves's tone perfectly, recounting moments we'd shared, and others we hadn't. Memories from my childhood, private thoughts I'd never said aloud. It was as if it wasn't reading my life from the outside, but pulling it from inside my own head. The line between me and it blurred, and I couldn't shake the dread that maybe it wasn't becoming him. Maybe it was becoming me. I tried to leave Sycamore Lane, bags packed, car running. But the moment I touched the handle, a soft knock echoed from the driver's side window. I turned, and there it was again, inches from my face. Its eyes were closer now to Reeves's, warm, almost kind, but still too still, too polished. I froze. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched, as if waiting to see if I'd recognize myself. I stayed that night, and the next, and the next. Each Halloween since, the knocks have returned. Always 3, always the same time. And sometimes, when I open the door, it doesn't even bother pretending anymore. It looks like Reeves, yes, but it speaks like me. It uses my phrases, my pauses, my heartbeat. And when it smiles, it's my smile stretched across his face. I moved away a year later, far from Sycamore Lane, to a town where no one knew my name. Yet on Halloween, at exactly midnight, the knock always finds me. It doesn't matter if I'm in a hotel or on the 15th floor of an apartment building. It always comes. I don't answer anymore. I sit in silence and wait for the sound to pass. But every year the voice that follows the knock grows clearer, more familiar. And last year, when I pressed my ear to the door, it whispered a single word in my own voice. my name. They called it Marrow House, a name that clung like soot to the wood even decades after the last resident fled. Perched on the edge of a forgotten valley, its sagging frame looked less like a home and more like a wound that refused to close. Every October someone claimed to hear it, a steady series of knocks echoing from within its walls, as if the house itself was trying to speak. Most dismissed it as folklore. But to us, a small university research team obsessed with the physics of hauntings, it was the perfect experiment. We arrived just before dusk, our van heavy with sensors, parabolic mics, and enough caffeine to fuel a vigil. I remember thinking the air felt strange there, dense, almost syrupy, as if sound itself moved slower. The windows were scabbed, over with grime, and the porch sagged under our weight, groaning like an old man disturbed from sleep. Still, we laughed and unpacked, eager to test the legend. That was our first mistake. The plan was simple: structured knocks, logged responses. If there was an acoustic explanation, a loose joist, shifting pressure, the data would reveal it. If not, well, that was the point. As the sun slid behind the trees, the house exhaled its first long sigh, boards flexing as the night settled in. Inside, the air smelled faintly metallic, like rain on rust, and every step stirred dust older than memory. We began just after midnight. 3 knocks. Wait, nothing. 3 more. This time, the house answered. 3 knocks, faint but deliberate, from somewhere deep within the walls. The sound was too precise for coincidence, timed perfectly, pitched just slightly lower than our own. We exchanged nervous glances and tried again. Tap, 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 tap. A pause, then 4 in return. It was less a house than a heartbeat, one that spoke through wood and time. But what we didn't expect was for it to get smarter. After 20 minutes, the responses weren't mirroring us anymore. They were anticipating us. Our 4th sequence hadn't even finished when the house knocked 5 times, like it knew the next question before we asked it. And then the patterns changed completely. 3 short knocks, 2 long, a pause, 1 short. It looked random until one of us, Mira, our linguist, gasped. "It's spelling something," she whispered. We translated the first sequence, ALEX. Alex, our lead researcher, frowned and called it a coincidence. Then came more letters, MIRA. Then my name. It wasn't random. It wasn't responding. It was calling us. At 2:17 a.m., the house stopped spelling and started counting. Dates. All of them passed. All of them tied to tragedies in that house. A fire in 1921, a disappearance in 1943. The final date, however, was tonight. We stared at the log in silence, the reality settling like cold water in our lungs. That's when the first door slammed shut on its own, sealing off the front hall. We laughed it off at first, calling it pressure differentials, old hinges. But Mira was the first to go missing. She'd gone upstairs to check a sensor and never came back. Her mic cut out mid-sentence. No scream, no struggle, just silence. Then Alex vanished. His equipment was still running, his notes scattered across the floor, but of him, nothing. That was when I realized we weren't knocking on a wall. We were knocking on a throat, and it had begun to swallow. The house fell silent again, the kind of silence that hums beneath your skin. Then, from the far end of the hall, it knocked once. Twice, 3 times, and this time it spelled only one thing. As the final letter thudded through the wall. My name, each syllable spaced by silence so deep it rang in my skull. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The house knew me. Not just the sound of my name, but the weight of it. It was as if the wood itself had inhaled my presence and was now exhaling it back, molecule by molecule. I whispered for Alex and Mira, but the walls swallowed my voice before it could echo back. That was when I realized how wrong we'd been. We thought we were studying the house. But the house had been studying us. The knocks came again, slower now, deliberate. 5, then 7, then 3. I checked the logbook with trembling hands. They weren't numbers. They were coordinates, and they pointed not to a place outside, but within. The cellar. Of course there was a cellar. Every legend like this has one. Alex had joked about it earlier. calling it the house's stomach. I used to laugh at metaphors like that. But as I pried open the door to the cellar and felt the air exhale from below, damp, metallic, ancient, the joke turned to truth. The stairs groaned under my weight, and the deeper I went, the more the house moved around me. The walls flexed and settled like muscle fibers adjusting to motion. My flashlight trembled in my grip. Halfway down, the knocking started again. Not from the walls now, but from inside the floorboards beneath me. I shone the light down and saw handprints smeared into the wood. Not fresh, but not old either. Pressed there as if someone had tried to climb out. At the base of the stairs was a single door, blackened with age, scarred by nails that had clawed it for decades. It knocked once as I approached, not on its surface, but from behind it, and then a second time, matching the rhythm of my heart. My fingers hovered over the handle. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run and never look back. But what happens when the building you're trapped inside isn't just a building, but a living thing, and you're already inside its body? I turned the handle. The door creaked open an inch. Inside, the darkness was so thick it looked solid, a liquid void. My flashlight beam was devoured before it could travel a foot. Then, from deep within that blackness, a single knock echoed back, louder than before, resonant, like the heartbeat of something vast and awake. Another, then another. 3 total. And between each knock, I heard my name, whispered not by one voice but many, layered and overlapping, like dozens of mouths pressed to the same wall. That was the moment I ran. Up the stairs, through the hall, past the equipment we'd so confidently brought to tame the unknown. The house shook as I fled, its knocks chasing me like footsteps. I don't remember leaving. Only the cold night air clawing at my lungs and the distant thud of the door slamming shut behind me. I never went back to Marrow House. No one did. It stands empty still, though I swear its roofline shifts when the wind changes. But some nights, especially near Halloween, I wake to a sound that doesn't belong in my home. 3 soft knocks, spaced by silence from somewhere deep in the walls, and when I listen closely, I swear I hear it spelling my name. As if the house didn't stay behind, but followed me home. It began as an obsession, the kind that starts as curiosity and metastasizes into something hungrier. For years I followed the knocks, 13 beats echoing across centuries, surfacing every Halloween like clockwork. They haunted police reports and campfire stories, threaded through urban legends and unmarked graves. Some swore they came from the dead begging to be let in. Others said they were warnings. But the deeper I dug, the clearer one truth became. They weren't isolated events. They were invitations. And invitations demand answers. The trail was colder than I expected, buried beneath folklore and false leads. But then I found it. A name scratched into the back of a parish record from 1881, St. Eloria's Chapel. It had been erased from every map, condemned and forgotten after a fire took its last congregation. But the coordinates, faint as ghost handwriting, led me to a clearing deep in the woods. There, swallowed by ivy and rot, stood a ruin of stone and silence. It didn't look like much, just a collapsed steeple and charred beams half-eaten by moss. But inside, beneath the fractured stained glass, 13 doors stood side by side along the chapel's inner wall. They weren't part of any blueprint I'd seen. Each one was sealed shut and bore a single carved mark, a symbol I'd seen etched on door frames in every story I'd studied. My pulse thrummed louder with each step, like my body recognized a truth my mind refused to name. The air inside the chapel was wrong. Too still, too heavy. Sound didn't echo here, it soaked. Even my breathing felt muted, swallowed whole by the space. I ran my fingers across one of the doors, tracing the grooves in the wood. Beneath the grime, faint lines pulsed faintly as though light were trapped just beneath the surface. My research had said nothing about that, and yet I felt certain I had seen this before, not in a building, but in something living. By nightfall, I had set up cameras, recorders, and sensors. I told myself I was here to observe, to collect data, but deep down, I knew this wasn't about science anymore. This was pilgrimage. As the sun bled out behind the trees and the chapel darkened, I felt the first tremor beneath my feet, faint, like a heart stirring after a long sleep. Then the knocking began. It started as a whisper, a single tap from the farthest door, then another from the next. Soon, all 13 were knocking, one after another like dominoes falling in time. The sound built slowly, rhythmically, until the entire chapel pulsed with it. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was a pattern. And the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't something trying to get in. It was something trying to get out of us. My hands shook as I flipped through my notes, cross-referencing symbols, sequences, dates. That's when I saw it. The 13th mark, carved deeper than the rest. It wasn't a symbol. It was a date. Tonight. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the floorboards, rattling my ribs. My equipment flickered and died one by one, until only the sound remained. And then, with a groan like wood being forced apart by something immense, one of the doors, the one at the center, began to creak open. From this side, the sound of that door moving was nothing like a hinge. It was deeper, wetter, as if muscle were peeling from bone. My flashlight stuttered in my grip, casting spasms of light across the chamber, and the wood seemed to breathe. I took a step closer, I don't know why. Curiosity and terror share the same pulse sometimes, and mine was pounding loud enough to drown the knocking. The air shifted with it, charged and alive, carrying a metallic tang that clung to my tongue like pennies. The center door cracked wider. Darkness yawned beyond it, but it wasn't the absence of light. It was textured, a shifting, oil-black tide that seemed to ripple in time with my heartbeat. It wasn't empty. It was aware, and in that awareness, something recognized me. My name whispered from somewhere deep inside the void, stretched thin, as though pronounced by a throat that had never spoken before. I staggered back, but the door didn't stop. It widened slowly, deliberately, like something savoring the act of opening. I shouted into the dark, questions, demands, maybe even prayers, but the knocking swallowed them whole. It wasn't echoing anymore. It was coming from me. Each beat of my heart landed in perfect unison with the knocks, until the line between the two vanished. What if the knocks were never from beyond, but from within? The thought rooted in my skull, colder than the wind cutting through the broken chapel windows. I pressed a hand to my chest, half expecting to feel wood there, pulsing beneath my skin. My breath came shallow and thin. The stories, the disappearances, the invitations. What if they hadn't been reaching outward at all? What if they had always been reaching back, responding to something already planted inside us? I crept closer to the open door. The darkness shifted again, coalescing into shapes that weren't quite shapes. Hints of limbs, of faces I half recognized. People I'd read about, names from reports. One face looked almost like mine, and through that churning mass came a sound I didn't expect. Knocking, yes, but now joined by whispers, overlapping, hungry, pleading. "Let us out." The door jolted wider, and a gust of air roared from the chamber, knocking me backward. My flashlight shattered against the stone floor. In the blackness, 13 distinct rhythms merged into one, shaking the chapel to its bones. My body moved without my permission, feet dragging toward the open threshold. It felt less like walking and more like being drawn back into something I'd once been part of. And maybe I had. My final thought before crossing was not of fear, but of inevitability. I understood now. The knocking had never been summoning anything new. It was simply reminding us of what had been trapped all along, the part of ourselves that wasn't meant to stay confined. The part that remembered I stepped through. Maybe I vanished that night, or maybe I didn't. Because every Halloween since, people still hear 13 knocks echoing through the dark, always followed by a door opening from the wrong side. And if you listen closely, if you press your ear to the wood and wait, you might hear me knocking back. Subscribe, if you dare.